Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Ahmed Moor, a non-resident fellow at the Foundation. Today is February 17th, and I'm delighted to be here with Noura Erakat. Noura is a professor of Africana Studies and Criminal Justice at Rutgers, New Brunswick. She's also the author of Justice for Some, Law, and the Question of Palestine. I've invited Noura to speak with me today because of an extraordinary Boston Review essay that she recently published. It speaks to what's happening in the United States today and how it relates to what's happening in Palestine and how these things are deeply intertwined. How the fight against fascism domestically can't be separated from the fight for justice in Palestine. We're going to get to that. But before we do, Noura, can you tell us about you? I mean, you're a prominent person. I think lots of people who either look at Twitter or Instagram or wherever are familiar with your advocacy work for Palestine. It's not primarily what you do, but there's this question, who are you and what are you motivated by?
Um, well, I am a Palestinian who is part of a Shettat, what translates to Palestinian diaspora. And I have been, born and raised in the United States with, and what I consider has been a stroke of just mere fortune that divided me or distinguished me from other Palestinians who might have been born stateless in a refugee camp or born refugees and under siege. It's a fortune that I have never taken for granted. And what motivates me is a broader sense of justice. I'm driven. When I first come into consciousness as a young girl, my first sense is my me in the world as a girl, and so I, developed a feminist analysis, a prepubescent feminist analysis before I had language for feminism. And it was that framework that actually helped me then understand racism in the United States and very quickly as well. Our Palestinian condition of unfreedom. And I have dedicated myself to all. I think social justice causes emancipatory struggles. And at some point in college, decided that I would focus on Palestine, not because I thought it was the most important, and not because I thought it was the only thing, but because at that point I realized how it actually was marginalized in the rest of the world, that as other topics were talked about, how Palestine was singled out and made exceptional and made more difficult to reach. And it was a decision between me and myself that there are a lot of people doing a lot of other work. There are very few that are working on Palestine as a matter of, just continuous advocacy. And so I happen to, yes, this is my work. This is my life's work now, as first as an organizer, then as a human rights attorney, now as a scholar and an advocate, very much focused on Palestine, subject matter expertise, and the advocacy. But my framework for liberation is much broader, and how I see it, and Palestine fits within that framework.
So, I mean, you often speak about concepts and ideas and abstractions, but I mean, is this a personal issue? Have you been to Palestine? Have you experienced the occupation firsthand? Do you have family there?
Yeah, well, absolutely. It's personal. I have been to Palestine. I've been traveling since I was 7 years old. My parents are from the West Bank, what's known as the West Bank, Abu Dis, just outside of East Jerusalem. My father's my father is one of the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from the West Bank whose Palestinian ID card was confiscated without due process in what's known as silent deportation. So I have traveled all my life to my homeland on an American passport. And I, like all Palestinians, have struggled to get across a very violent border that aims to fragment us and that seeks through basically seeks to ethnically cleanse Palestinians by way of expulsion and refusal of entry. But I started to travel by myself to Palestine at age 16. And then when I was in college, actually, kind of a fun fact, my parent, I think people don't understand that not all Palestinian parents want their children involved in this. For a lot of parents and families that, manage to, start a life elsewhere, they want their kids to do something else, right? And in their minds, there's this idea that if you're well and you make a lot of money, somehow you would, do great. So this is actually a point of contention between my family and I, that I wanted to do this. And so the first time that I traveled to volunteer in Dahesha refugee camp, in Aqbat al-Jabr refugee camp, I used a scholarship that I received for housing to buy an airplane ticket and explain to my family that I was being sent on a program. Had they understood that I used money that was for housing to get an airline ticket to go volunteer, in refugee camps, they wouldn't have approved, right? This was not within their framework. And so that part has been a struggle, but it is very, very obviously very personal. I have a tremendous amount of family, primarily in the West Bank. And like all Palestinians, we've been affected by it. Those who have been imprisoned, those who have been active, those who have been killed. But I want to also make clear that for a lot of Palestinians, like my experience of being able to spend that time on the ground, and then I travel regularly, right? I've traveled regularly as a matter of work, but also to visit, to build friendships, to lead delegations for family weddings, for friends' weddings, right? Every single time is this very, very stressful experience, because I know I'm either going to be denied entry, and when I leave, I realize I might not be allowed back in. I've also worked with organizations on the ground, including the Badil Refugee Center, Resource Center for Refugee and Residency Rights in Bethlehem. I've interned with the Adala Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights at that time it was Shafa Amr, now it's in Haifa. So yes, I have this experience. Like I maintain this contact. I go with regularity, but I want to emphasize that not all Palestinians can, and that doesn't reduce their connection or their understanding, and it doesn't reduce how personal this is, and how it defines our entire existence and our lives. I mean, the fact
And so
that
I guess,
for
was it
example.
radicalizing for you? Was it radicalizing to go and see this stuff up close and really as an adult with the awareness of what it all meant and why it all existed?
I'll tell you this, the radicalization, at a young age, at a very young age, to see the disparate development, for example, from where I'm from in Abu Dis, and then how not East Jerusalem necessarily, but even East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem is like a different universe, right? That disparate kind of, you're in two different worlds completely.
Yeah, you're talking about infrastructure and the way things work
Infrastructure,
in public
development,
transport. Yeah.
economy, transportation, right? It was in that moment when I saw that difference. I never thought, like former presidential candidate Kerry tried to, and then Secretary of State Kerry tried to say that this was somehow the Palestinians' fault, that they weren't as developed. I never ever had, I saw that and immediately knew, right, that this was not natural. Right. That was at a young, and that was because I was a girl who was told that I had a certain role to play in the world, and that was naturalized. And my rejection of that was also the lens that allowed me to see this disparate development and very instinctively say, this is not natural. Later, when you say, when I went as an adult, right, and on my own, and especially in the refugee camps, that's when it got really complex for me, because I started to see that the levels of analysis that shape Palestinian life are not just between Palestinians and Zionists. right? But that are internal to Palestinian society. And the way that they're, the internal fissures, class, right? Particularly class, but also statuses as refugees, in which families that you're from, and gender, those things, and obviously race as well, those things affect us internally. And now it becomes much more complex. And then then I go to refugee camps in Lebanon, right? I was in the Badawi in Tripoli for one summer. And then it got even more complicated, because now I'm thinking, wow, there's also a way the treatment of Palestinians in the Arab world, right? And obviously the treatment of refugees is distinct from Lebanon to Syria to Jordan in particular. But Lebanon is particularly awful, awful, right? And really defining of the racialization of Palestinians in Lebanon, and now giving me and then the distinction within Lebanese society,
Mhm.
right? That animates different political currents. And so, those who do, align with a particular political current, whom align Palestinians, and those who's aligned their future with Palestinians across the Arab world, this was the complexity. So the radicalization never happened where I see this and I'm like, oh my God, right? um, I can't believe Palestinians are treated like this. I had a sense, right, from a young age, very young age, that, the treatment of Palestinians was structural. But it was at the later age, it was just the ways that it became so much more complex to me, that I wanted, that I began to study these things and to care about, I care a lot. I care a lot about nuance. Sometimes it doesn't matter. But a lot of times it does. And that's what I, try to tease out in, I think that when you write, you have space to tease that out. And when you're in advocacy mode, there's not a lot of space, because in advocacy mode, we've been, especially in the past 16 months, in the words of Halal Alian, we've been forced to audition for our humanity. And each of, what I've said is that the West has rendered our right to survival as probationary, right? And so in those settings, there isn't room for complexity. You're raging against the machine. You're exposing, the racism that's shaping a conversation that's being had. You're exposing complicity of the media and of Western powers and those who have interests. But beyond that, right, in these different spaces, then why do these complexities matters, and how do we navigate it, especially to think about ourselves, which is where I'm at right now, right?
Mhm.
And I take heed from, I'm part of the Journal of I'm an editorial board member of the Journal of Palestine Studies, currently stewarded by its first woman editor, Professor Shireen Sayyid, a historian. And in that, in that framework of Palestine studies, there's a current that understands Palestine studies within a framework of indigenous studies as opposed to settler colonial studies. And the distinction here is the study of ourself, right? What do we gain as we study ourselves? And I'm also a member of the Palestine Feminist Collective, and their work is really instructive here as well, where they create a distinction between anti-colonial proxies and decolonial proxies. The anti-colonial proxies is aimed at dismantling Zionism and the structures of oppression, versus decolonial proxies, which aim to basically create alternative societies for ourselves that's internally focused, right? Not waiting for national liberation to begin to work on other dimensions of
So,
our liberated selves. And
so I mean,
so
on those themes, you've brought up feminism a few times now, and it's occurred to me in the past, there's this flattening of Palestinian society from the outside,
from
perfect
the
victims,
outside,
imperfect victims, whatever it is. It's a fairly traditional society in lots of ways. And you go to the refugee camps you spoke about with Badawi, but also Nahr al-Balad in Lebanon, certainly Gaza, where my family's from, where I'm from, where I was born. it's a traditional society in lots of ways, and questions of feminism and the first president of the Palestine Studies research program being a woman. These questions are hard to litigate in the context of occupation. The social development is hard to push from within the context of occupation. How do you think about those complexities from the reality of kind of working like anybody else from within a traditional society for social advancement in the context of apartheid and occupation?
It's a really good question. Also, I want to add, Ahmed, and I should have said this at the top. I've been to Gaza also a few times, right? And so part of a legal fact-finding delegation in 2009, and then before leading a delegation. And so, my concern for Gaza is also born through, obviously as a Palestinian, but so many Palestinians will never visit Gaza, are not allowed to. It's so difficult, so difficult. And to gain entry. And so also it was those experiences that primed me, right? To all the themes. Like since 2009, I was already familiar with all in the aftermath of the first large scale onslaught, all
Gaslit.
the themes that have come to full on fruition in this moment. But I've been working on that, for 15 years, for more now, right? And anyway, but I just want to say that, yeah, I really have, when you say, are you there? Yes, very much. And I'm very lucky. And I might be one of those few people who have had that experience. And it might even, nonetheless, despite that much time on the ground, study, work, familial relationships, I'm still very much, right, Palestinian American in my, in my attitudes, in the world that I live in the audiences that I engage, right, in where I think my battle is and my role is to play. And I think that's important to point out because there's also a frustration that we don't do this enough as Palestinians, for Palestinians, by Palestinians, amongst ourselves. And I just want to highlight that there's also this complexity, like where you're at also, and what you decide to do, and how, the language that you use to speak also reflects certain decisions that one makes, that we often sound different, right? I remember this vividly. Sorry, I'm not answering your question. I'll get there. But I remember this vividly when Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar were trying to visit Palestine, and basically were effectively denied entry. That Rashida, and this was, the Trump administration didn't want them there. They didn't want them to see it. And Rashida would have had to sign a waiver that basically, said that she wouldn't say anything about what it's awful, so that she could see her grandma. She ended up not going, which was the right thing to do. But I remember I was in Palestine at the time, and I remember listening to the conversation in the US, and the conversation very much, centered on how evil the Trump administration was and that denial of entry. But for Palestinians, right, we were listening to that and we were like, this is the Palestinian condition. Palestinians are not allowed entry, and this is a form of forced population transfer and removal, right? And so even where you're at in that very same moment defined how that conversation was being had. Anyway, you're asking me, how do we discuss social complexities under harsh conditions of oppression? And I think that we're not the first to answer that question. I think that all liberation movements have also answered the question of how do they deal with the internal cleavages and other forms of oppression. And the oft remark is, first we liberate ourselves and then we deal with our complexities, because that's the priority. Otherwise, we're creating internal cleavages. And I get that. At face value, that makes sense. But in practice, it's not true. In practice, it's not true. And this is why. We are fighting so hard against an adversary, an enemy, right? That they become our prime focus in a way that diminishes our own power, in a way that occludes, right, a thinking about ourselves of what we would do if we were in power. right? If today we were in power, how would we govern ourselves? How would we organize ourselves socially? What would we do, right? And I don't think, we have these fanciful ideas of what that would look like. Some people might respond, whatever we want, as long as as long as Zionism is gone. I feel that. I feel that hard. But that work of what we would do and how we would do it is actually building the foundation for a ground for us to stand on, right? Of who we are and what it is that we're working for and towards. Now we're working actively for something as opposed to against something. And that process of working for something is also what helps reveal a lot of things to us in the process of how it is that we get free. It help us build the society that we want to be in, right? And the grounds and the ways that we want to interact with one another. It shapes our treatment, right? It shapes that future. It shapes that future in a way that I think offers a lot of inspiration, and helps us. I think so many. I think going the right of return for Palestinian refugees is a journey into the future, right? We're not going back to Palestine 1947. We're going into the future of Palestine that's yet to be created, and we have to engage in what that looks like. So no, I don't think that working on our internal issues and specifically, obviously, feminist questions diminishes us. It makes us so much stronger. It makes us so much stronger. We're not detracting. We're building the future that we want to live in. And that's the work of the Palestine Feminist Collective. It's also the work of Talat, the network of Palestinian women that organize themselves in order to oppose the murder of women, um,
Mhm.
and our sisters, and the spike in that. There's a way in which, as violence is meted against us, especially as the structure of military occupation and the constant structure of violence that we start that goes home, that manifests itself within the home, right? And this is not particular to Palestinians, but others who have done this work, like Cynthia Enlow, demonstrating how the militarization of societies also, increases, heightens domestic violence, and so on and so forth. And not to take it for, it also needs to be said that so much of the front-facing leadership of Palestinians is men across the political spectrum, across our diplomatic venues. I'm talking about the state, the quasi-state and the political parties. But the work that is being done on the grounds, that I would say in almost all the organizing spaces I've been in, is primarily led by women. Women who are, figuring out either, this a framework of sumud, of holding the family together, of maintaining, continuity of education, right? Of making sure that um, the social reproduction of life, even under harsh conditions. But also, if you just think about it, look at the movements that have taken. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, and so I can tell you this is all anecdotal, but even in the past 16 months and the travels that I did to the many campuses, all of them have been led by young women. And so, you know, I think it would be silly of us, silly of us not to consider what future are these women who are fighting so hard for Palestinian liberation, where do they fit in? When we talk about Palestinian freedom, whose freedom are we speaking of? Are
I
we
think
willing?
that's,
Mm,
no, I appreciate the comprehensive answer, and frankly, I agree with you. I think there's a view that we don't want to talk too much about some of the embedded prejudices or challenges that we have as a traditional society in lots of ways, because that'll invite all kinds of scrutiny or may not conform to this idea of Palestinians as being liberatory and fighting for something which is perfectly correct and right. And the reality is there are lots of warts, and we're not served by looking away or trying to obscure those warts.
But Ahmed, let's be clear, two things can be true at once. There are no
Yeah,
perfect societies. It's not like we have to like suddenly be better than the rest of humanity, right?
for
Which
sure.
which society um doesn't, isn't patriarchal?
Yeah.
Are you look at the one
Again, I
that they're
appreciate.
taking away here in the United States? There, there's a war against abortion. There's a war against trans children, right? There's a war against even queer identity. There's an emphasis on a nuclear family. There's a desire for the strong head of the family, like in a patriarchal structure. Where is there not a patriarchy that defines all societies, and yet suddenly Palestinians need to be better and different than everybody else? And so I think, it's emphasis that two things can be true. We are not perfect. Nobody is perfect. And that cannot be demanded of us to also be able to live outside of a structure of elimination. We are marked for removal and death. We are marked for dispossession. Our lives, our survival is probationary according to colonial powers in the United States. And this is, we are so thoroughly dehumanized that there has been, and this is getting to the essay, I suppose, that there's an absolute blind spot about how much violence Palestinians endure, even in the United States, for example, right? And racist violence, and yet people can't recognize it because we've been just so thoroughly dehumanized. And so two things can be true. And I think it just makes us stronger. Like, I am not concerned about a Western gaze. I have nothing to prove to anybody in order to indict settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation as illegitimate systems of governance and of a structure. I do
Very,
not
very
have to,
helpful transition.
we can be the worst humans on earth, and that structure is still immoral and illegitimate. Period.
Noura, you nailed it. You're 100% correct, and I really appreciate
I'm
that.
not
I
trying to be
agree.
correct. I'm just impassioned. Sorry.
So I appreciate the segue also. I mean, that one of the themes of this essay is that misery doesn't exactly love company, but it's got company. And it's
Mm.
Boomerang Comes Back is the name of the essay. I'm going to read a little bit now. I'm going to read in a few places, so I may interrupt you again because I think it's so beautifully written. But this is directly from the essay. Simply put, most people have no idea to what extent this genocide is being perpetrated not only by Israel, but also by the United States. For a solid majority of the center left, what is happening in Gaza is tragic, but ultimately less important than the most significant existential threat, the ascendance of Trump. During the run-up to the election, the argument goes, we Palestinian Arab Americans should have understood that resisting fascism in the United States is the primary goal and gotten in line accordingly. But resisting fascism is our collective goal. So, what do you mean here? What is the boomerang? Who's Amy Cesar? Um, what is all this about?
All right. So thank you for setting that up. And you're right. Writing, this writing is tortured. It's also a reflection of a lot of thinking and a lot of drafts and an editorial process and reviews. And so that's why, you know, it's much safer to publish something that you've worked on and polished than to speak somewhere where you can miss a word. And I'm sure you know this, but I know this very well. Like, it's not easy, right? And so always, I appreciate having the space to be able to write. And I encourage, I love to read, and I know that for me, reading didn't become more, especially as an activist, didn't become, more of a priority until later. And so, because you just never have time and everything is so urgent. So, but I think, we all have homework. We all have homework to do. Here, what I'm pointing out is what I was struggling with in the lead up to this awful election and in the fallout from the election, right? And even now we see this like coming up again. But there seemed to be this understanding that whatever Palestinians can say about the genocide and the US's role in it, that all of that was secondary to making sure that there wasn't an ascendance of Trump. And what we have been trying to communicate is like, this is a US genocide. And in order to perpetrate this genocide, a democratic administration, which has overseen it, right, has basically created the conditions to be able to support it militarily, financially, and diplomatically, unequivocally. And so the very same concerns that you have about Trump and his ascendance and what he would do to a democracy and the rule of law in the United States, the Biden administration has been doing fervently. We saw that with Anthony Blinken, right? Lying under oath about assurances about how Israel, about, access to humanitarian aid. We see this when the Democratic establishment absolutely disregards 80% of its base, which is demanding a ceasefire. What democratic representation? We see this when we see Congress, right, threaten to defund the United Nations should it engage in its role as maintaining peace and security. We see this in the US wanting to undermine the International Criminal Court by, they didn't go as far as sanctioning it immediately, but they went as far as maligning it and maligning the ruling of the International Court of Justice. We saw the United States dismantle international mechanisms of accountability, as well as domestic structures of democratic governance and accountability, all under a democratic administration. And yet people were freaking out about Trump and not aware that whatever Trump was going to do, he was doing based on what the Democrats have paved, a path that they have paved. So when we are out there protesting and the genocide, my goodness, it was the demand was so basic. Do not veto a ceasefire. Start weapons transfers in compliance with the Genocide Convention, which is not merely to punish genocide, but to prevent genocide. Here we were fighting for these things, but in that fight, we were basically fighting to preserve the basic structures within the United States that would protect people in the United States. The bifurcation of those two things, the inability to see the connection between them, I think has been, the thing that we're still grappling with. Anyway, I guess,
So you give a concrete example. I mean, you write, and again, I'm reading from the essay here, Hitler's genocide of European Jews was modeled after European rule over African and Asian colonies. And you're talking about the German extermination Nama and Herero people in Namibia during the period of colonial rule from 1884 to 1915. And then some 75 years later, Cesar's point has been borne out many times over. There's no clear dividing line between a colonial power's imperial geography and its metropole. So these concepts, I think, are really important to define. But a last example, counterinsurgency in Vietnam further militarized U.S. police, ushering SWAT teams, military-grade weapons, willingness to deploy them domestically. And we saw that, of course, with the Iraq War when excess hardware was re-imported into the United States. So can you just elaborate on this idea that there's not a there and a here so much?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, you asked me about Césaire at the top, and I didn't answer the question because I got into why should we read? Why should we write? Aimé Césaire is a Martinican essayist, author, activist, who writes in 1950, what's described as a searing polemic, a discourse on colonialism. This is directly in the aftermath of the Second World War, particularly the revelation of a Jewish Holocaust, and now the consecration of genocide as a crime, right? A treaty that's written in 1948 that now makes the destruction of a people as such based on the racial, ethnical religious national identity, with the intent to destroy them as now being criminal, right? And so this is 2 years later. This is a world, mind you, where the US is very explicitly, had the apartheid convention been drafted at this point in 1948, the US would have been described as an apartheid regime, right? It's a white settler colony and would have been described as such. We know that the world is still colonized, right? Portugal is still in Mozambique and Angola and Cape Verde. The French are in Algeria. You know, the British is slowly diminishing as an empire, but not completely. And yet there's no condemnation of these other systems, right? There's no condemnation of a transatlantic slave trade as genocidal. There's no condemnation of the decimation and the genocide of indigenous peoples and the recognition of these genocides. There's just no recognition, right, of the at that point of the Nama and Herero people, that somehow there's this distinction. These European powers made Hitler out to be the most evil, right? And distinguished themselves from Hitler. And what Cicero comes back to say is, all of you have little Hitlers inside of you. You're all little Hitlers.
Big
And
Hitlers in
the
some cases. Sorry.
what?
I
And
said
yeah,
big Hitlers in
but
some
you know,
cases.
there was a way in which these Western colonial powers were rehabilitating. They are rehabilitating their own selves by pointing out that this was the worst evil. And really, the distinction of what's happening here is that for the first time, these methods of annihilation are borne out within Europe's shores. And so here it was, you know, it was the emphasis that you cannot separate what a colonial power does in its colonial geography with what happens domestically. And that desire to want to separate those things actually limits us and what we can do. And so then I do give those examples. Julian Go is a sociologist who studies, you know, the boomerang effect and how it impacted law enforcement, the militarization of US law enforcement in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War and the occupation of the Philippines in particular, but also, you know, Guam and Puerto Rico and Cuba in 1898. But then there's the Vietnam War, where we also see methods of counterinsurgency come back to the United States. The first time SWAT teams, which are developed in, you know, the Vietnam War, the first time they're used in the United States is to attack a Black Panther Party chapter in Los Angeles. Right? And then we see this, you know, the same thing happens, like whether it be Guantanamo Bay, NSA surveillance, right? The expansion of presidential powers during the so-called war on terror, that has totally eroded, you know, US privacy rights, you know, due process rights. And so, and then what I'm saying is that boomerang came back almost in real time to the United States as we insisted on perpetrating genocide.
And
And that,
here you're talking, when you say real time, you're talking about the reaction to the campus protests. You're talking to the series of kind of congressional hearings which sought to criminalize pro-Palestine activity. I mean, what's the range of things that have emerged over the past year and a half
I mean, you're
that
naming
reflected
them. You're
boomerang?
naming them. I give the examples of, you know, I cite these like aggregate numbers that have been put together by the Palestine Legal, by the Council of American Islamic Relations, just the spike in like people getting fired, harassed, doxxed, stalked, right? Or the way that Palestinians were out and out attacked physically, right? Run over by cars, stabbed, shot. Um, we just we just saw in Miami yesterday a Zionist shoot two Israelis with the intent to kill them, thinking that they were Palestinian. I mean, there has been a spike even in that physical violence that is a fallout of what the government is doing. That's also, you know, you worry about Trump's hate. There has been hate here, fomented because in order to be able to perpetuate genocide, the US has had to frame Palestinians, Arab Americans, and American Muslims more generally as a threat within, as a latent threat, that we're all presumed as guilty, right? And violently and prone to violence and as anti-Semitic. I mean, all these things happen to be part of the racialization and part of anti-Palestinian racism, right? The erasure and the occlusion of Nakba, all of these ways that, we're racialized here, right? That then desensitizes audiences to the violence that's perpetrated against us. So that there aren't people aren't freaking out when they see this violence. When I remember it was on the day 100, when 10,000 Palestinian children had already been killed, and Biden comes out with a statement on the 100 days of genocide to mourn the Israelis that were killed on October 7th, and not one word about 10,000 Palestinian children. I mean, he is priming audiences, right, to be desensitized to Palestinian suffering and the value of our life in a way that for Americans, now they're just not even, I think they're just not recognizing at all. Like there was just this constant discourse that was over there and not realizing this is here. When there are snipers on rooftops of universities aimed at unarmed students who are demanding accountability from their university in the tradition of campus activism that is so celebrated as part of the civil rights movement, that is so celebrated as part of the anti-apartheid movement, that suddenly that couldn't be recognized as the amount of violence, the sending in of mobs at UCLA, the arresting of students, the raiding their home, the inability to recognize that has to do with the way that these students have been racialized as dangerous.
And so that really is kind of the top of the argument. And now that treatment's extending to other groups. Is that
Always.
is that it?
It always is. And that was why, I keep insisting we Palestinians are the canary in the coal mine. This is the idea that canaries are sent into mine, and that I think if it's particularly toxic, right?
Yeah, they're the
That
first to die.
they're
Yes.
the first to die. And Palestinians are the canary in the coal mine. We are demonstrating I'm talking about this on a global level as well. Like, you think that you can just do this, that, the Western colonial powers can basically arm a genocide of a besieged population who are primarily refugees, who are being starved to death and denied medical treatment and being bombarded with weapons technology, recklessly and directly targeting Palestinians, who are the majority of whom are children under the age of 18 and denied safe quarter. And the world watches that and thinks that's going to be contained, you
And so
know.
basically, yeah, part of me, I'm an embittered and angry person, I have to admit. And I see Elon Musk seek to wreck Germany's governing authorities, and I go, great, these people are fundamentally genocidal, and I'm okay with that. But the reality is these people also hurt ordinary people. And so how do we begin to link the struggles domestically in Palestine or here in the United States? How do we begin to think? I mean, help me. You've diagnosed the problem. How do you think about, because I'm not a Democrat. I have no interest in working with the Democratic Party. That's not my political home. So where do we go?
It's a really good question. I have been stumped. Everybody wants to know the answer. How is it that we contend with this moment? And the best answer that I can give you is that how we do it and what's necessary will reveal itself in the work. We can't sit here and intellectualize how that will happen. It will have to happen in the course of joint struggle, where the answers reveal themselves to us as what's most effective, right? So, for example, even all of this analysis that I'm providing to you about the boomerang effect, and this blowback, essentially, right? So much of that intellectual production happens as a result of what's dubbed Black Palestine solidarity and the renewal of it in 2014 to the present, when in 2014, Ferguson, Missouri is placed under occupation, literally in the aftermath of yet another, state-sanctioned murder of a young, unarmed Black human, in this case, right? It was Mike Brown, killed by Darren Wilson. Well, that happened 3 weeks into the 2014 Israeli onslaught of Gaza, right? And in that moment, there was a tremendous amount of organizing on the ground of the Palestinians that were in Ferguson, but also the Palestinians who were watching, who end up, advising protesters how to deal with tear gas, right? And so here begin these seeds of a renewal, because Black Palestine solidarity, I think, in 2014, it's dubbed Black Palestine, but I think historically, at the apex of it, in the context of Third World Revolt, it was better understood as basically internationalism, right? And a particular kind of Black internationalism in the United States, that aligned itself and saw its future as aligned with, colored peoples and oppressed peoples all over the world, of understanding that there is no way to secure equality and a livelihood in the United States while the United States remained, the perpetrator of state violence abroad, right? And so in the course of now it's dubbed Black Palestine Solidarity, um, a lot of this work is revealed. A lot of the, and some of that work, I I I study this as a scholar, but as an activist, it's also very committed to it. But one of the stories, that I found the most inspiring happens in 2018 in Durham, North Carolina, where a coalition of Jewish, Black, and Palestinian activists wage a campaign to abolish their police department training in Israel, right? And so there you see, a lot of things are revealed, chasms within the American Jewish community, those, Jews who see that the only way that they can be safe is through more militarization, more weapons, more gates, more, more violence, and those who see that their future, that the only way for Jews to be safe even in the United States is in solidarity with other communities who are similarly attacked. And so you see these internal chasms as well, that tell us a lot about, how people want to define their futures. They successfully abolish the Durham Police Department from training in Israel. They're the only ones that were successful in their campaign. And I think that that is a wonderful example. When you say where to from here, for me, it's that work that understands that the local is global, right? It's the targeting, for example, of G4S as a security firm that's used in US prisons, that's used as part of, ICE detention facilities, but also that's used as a way to maintain, the restriction on Palestinian movement, and the control over their lives. I think very much, the idea of what the Palestinian-led protests on campuses of demanding, disclosure and divestment, and demanding that, universities not be invested in military weapons corporations is another instance of where the local is global. And particularly in this instance, it has to do with a broader picture of, the attack on, federal government spending and education. Yes, the Trump administration wants to disembowel the DOE, but so too did the Biden administration shrink the budget for the DOE. Under the Biden administration, I think it's that the five a single Lockheed Martin, I think it was Lockheed Martin, excuse me if I'm wrong, but there's 5 major weapons manufacturers. One of them is Lockheed Martin. And singularly, it received more funding from the federal government than all of the DOE, right? And so this work, and then what happens, right? Then these weapons manufacturers end up subsidizing the universities that are being, impoverished because their funding is being denied. And now you have CEOs of these weapons manufacturers on the board of trustees of universities who are deciding on the future of what students do. So very much the students who are demanding divestment from these companies are basically also demanding the protection of academic freedom. They're demanding that, that education is a public right, and that good education is a public right, that not only the rich are to get an education, right? That this should be subsidized. And so there, when I think about where from here, that's where the entwinement is, right? How are these systems of death making and that are experimented on Palestinian bodies, frankly, and what becomes a Trojan horse for them because you know the right
Rebounds.
uses the right and the left uses these liberal left, I should say, not the radical left, but like the Dems and the Republicans both use Palestine as the Trojan horse to then inaugurate uh, very repressive policies. And so I
Well,
do think that the way forward is being able to recognize that the fight for Palestine is not just the fight for some people thousands of miles away, but it's what folks have been emphasizing. Palestine will set everyone free.
and that's a great headline statement. And then I want to get into the weeds a little bit. What does a shared domestic agenda for resistance look like? I mean, you've highlighted some of the things that we should care about: demilitarization, adequate funding for universities, and so forth. But where do we go beyond that? I mean, we're going to start organizing in the streets, grassroots. What is the shared agenda?
Look, here I go to the experts. I go to the organizers, the folks who have dedicated their whole lives to doing this work. And I think that we should turn to them. The activists who have been doing this work have a sense of where we're at and what we need. And that, for me, I can only tell you like top line that when I write an essay like this, I am writing to the folks who literally have the gall, right? To see Trump suggest the forcible removal of Palestinians from Gaza, where the US is going to take ownership of it. And their response to that is, okay, are you happy you got rid of Biden now? As opposed to, holy shit, what have we done? Right? Where any representative of the United States has been so emboldened and wants to do this in our name. They're so concerned. They're just so overly concerned with the domestic election campaign that they cannot even see beyond their nose to understand that Trump would not be in a position to say this if the Biden administration did not systematically fund and facilitate the destruction of Gaza and its people, right? And so for me, the top line agenda, look, we have to unite. There is no way, historically, it's been demonstrated that defeating fascism and a fascist government requires alliances, broad-based alliances, that are going to be based on tremendous disagreement. I don't agree with these folks, but we have to agree that US imperialism cannot, is bad. Basic. You have to, and I think part of the problem is that most people, as Americans especially, um, don't even understand what imperialism is and don't see ourselves as an imperial power, can't tell you what our relationship to Puerto Rico or Hawaii is, right? Or what our relationship on, these occupied lands are, let alone what the fact that we have the largest number of military bases all over the world, and that it's precisely because of our military power and our economic dominance, that we can undermine international legal institutions and undermine cooperation between states. So top line, it's what analysis is going to help us build those bridges on the domestic level, Ahmed. I do think that the activists are showing us the way. And I do think, that we have a sense of what needs to be done. There's going to have to be mass mobilization. And everybody who's been, protesting genocide has already shown us how it's done. They shut down freeways, they occupied buildings, they got arrested, right? They organized strikes, massive rallies. There cannot be what is being termed anticipatory obedience, where in an effort to save ourselves from punishment from the Trump administration, that we go into hiding. That only emboldens, the Trump administration. There has to be a willingness to resist and to say no and to take risks and to do it collectively in massive numbers. And we've already seen that in the rallies that are taking place to protect migrants across the country. I think that we need to see more of it. We should be mindful of the language that Trump is using. He wants to use Guantanamo Bay to forcibly deport undocumented people. I mean, and then using the language, the criminalization of undocumented people, or the criminalization of immigrants, period, in order to make people okay with that forcible treatment. All of that is predicated on the war on terror. And what happened to Muslims and Arabs, right? That we Americans have been primed for that, and they're using that same playbook. It would not be possible without it. And so take care of the canaries. Do not let Palestinians be the Trojan horse. Do not let them set the precedent to allow these policies to come in through the back door that disembowels whatever you love and what's left. And so I hope that I'm not obviously not an organizer. I'm a professor. And so I would defer to the organizers who are going to tell us what to do. And I just hope that some of this, this work that I do in my analysis and my scholarship helps to shape it. But they know better than me.
Thank you so much to Noura Erakat for sharing your time and analysis today. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast. And we'll link to Noura's fantastic essay in the Boston Review. You can watch this episode on YouTube as well. And you can listen on SoundCloud or Spotify. Thank you again, Noura.
Thanks for having me, Ahmed. يعطيك العافية.